The globalization of agricultural trade has created strong linkages across markets all around the world. Domestic policies, especially those of large countries, have widespread consequences on producers and consumers. Traditionally, agricultural trade policies and farm support have been the focus of both analysts and policymakers. For instance, during the Rio round, new constraints have been put on the amount of subsidies that the European Union and the United States can give to their farmers. This has been done in order to reduce the negative externalities that such policies have on other producers by depressing the world prices. Nowadays, we start to see new policies that affect agricultural markets. But in this case, they try to bring prices upwards. The policies I am going to discuss now are the biofuel policies. Biofuel mandates have been implemented in most OECD and emerging economies. Their first goals was to limit greenhouse gas emissions, to promote energy security, and to support farmers through new channels. The key idea is to replace fossil fuel by fuel made from biomass. The first generation of biofuels are mainly made from crops. And we have seen large amounts of corn used to produce in the United States ethanol, and large volume of vegetable oil, first of all rapeseed, processed in the European Union to produce biodiesel. This increased demand has put more pressure on agricultural prices. Biofuel demand of crops has created new opportunities for farmers, but also new challenges for consumers. We have first a direct competition between the use of crops for biofuel and the traditional demand coming from the food or the feed sector. At the same time, we have also an indirect competition going through the input market, where fertilizers and land and water can be now used to produce agricultural goods for biofuel instead than for human or animal consumption. In this context, stakeholders start to think a little more deeply about the relevance of putting crops into cars than into the food chain. This question is particularly relevant today because many research have shown that the initial environmental benefits of biofuel seem to be less important than expected, in particular due to what has been called the land use effect. Nevertheless, we have to keep in mind that to produce ethanol and biodiesel, we can use different feedstock: sugarcane, corn, wheat for ethanol, rapeseed oil, soybean oil, palm oil for biodiesel. And these different commodities have different impact on both food markets, but also in terms of emission balance. Just a few examples. Of course, more demand of crop for biofuel is going to increase agricultural prices, as any kind of demand, but the magnitude will depend a lot on the size of the market and also the supply capacity in this field. For instance, the demand of wheat from ethanol sectors get a very small effect, not more than 2% of increase of the world prices of wheat. For corn, because we are talking a much larger amount, the price effect can be between 4 and 50%. But for vegetable oil, we are on the upper range with price increase due to biofuel between 15 and 14%. And if for corn, the main victim is the livestock sector, and through and the food price effect go through the meat and the dairy and is a little more indirect. In the case of vegetable oil, used for biodiesel, we are directly touching a key staple food for many populations in South Asia, North Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa. Food policy are mainly implemented through mandate, meaning that blenders have to incorporate a given amount of biofuel or a given share of biofuel. It implies that the domestic demand for biofuel in the two largest markets, the European Union and the United States, is nearly totally inelastic to prices, meaning that if agricultural prices go up, the cost of producing biofuel will go up, but the demand of biofuel is not going to be reduced. At the same time, agricultural markets are structurally quite inelastic because we have constraints on both the demand side, people have to eat, and on the supply side, it takes time to produce agricultural goods. And so we are introducing a totally inelastic demand in an already inelastic system. And the consequence is that price fluctuation will increase when perturbation comes. We have also another effect that is due to the role of the biofuel demand in the total increase of demand for agricultural commodities in the last 6 or 7 years. We have already been in the context of tense agricultural markets with booming demand, in particular in Asia, several negative climatic events that have affected key producers in Australia, in the EU, in the US, in Russia, depending on the year. And in this context, the strong and quick increase of demand of agricultural goods by the biofuel sector has contributed to reduce the rate of refilling of inventories, of grain inventories, and has even contributed in some years or depleting these inventories. And we know that when stocks are low, markets are much more volatile. On one hand, we can see more speculation by private agents, but on the other hand, we see also much more panic behavior, in many cases by governments that lack the relevant information. And just as an illustration, keep in mind that in the last 7 years, if you look at what has been the source of increased demand of corn, 70% come from biofuel. In the case of rapeseed, it's 90%. Let's summarize our key findings about the relation between biofuel and food prices. In the medium run, biofuel policies will increase food prices in a very moderate proportion, in particular at a national level, because food prices are composed by a multitude of different prices, and the processing sector in itself lead to large disconnection between raw commodity prices and processed food. That is the main source of consumption in modern economies. But for some products, and in particular for some categories of consumer, especially the poorest, the effects will be much more severe. On the long run now, this increase of demand may provide new incentive for the private sector to invest in research and development in order to increase yield and productivity in the long term. And therefore this will benefit all consumers. But the main challenge we face today is the short-run effect. And because due to their nature, the current policies can contribute significantly to increase price volatility. And this is exactly what we do not want, and this is why we need to rethink the modalities of this policy in order to reduce this distortive effect to reduce their impact on volatility. And to this regard, if you think that biofuel policies may be used to support farmers, we start to have a policy tool that is much more toxic than what have existed before, in particular when it was decoupled payment.